It was a strange thing to see, a painting of the sky hanging in an ordinary living room. Most people would expect to see a traditional landscape, or perhaps a family portrait, but this was no ordinary piece of art. The painting was vast, almost too large for the space it occupied, and yet it fit perfectly on the wall above the fireplace. It wasn't just a depiction of the sky, but a moment frozen in time, a moment that seemed to shift the more you looked at it. The colors were impossibly vibrant, blending together in ways that felt almost surreal, as though the artist had captured something otherworldly. Eleanor, a woman in her late 30s, was the owner of the house where the painting hung. She had inherited it from her grandmother, who had always spoken of it as though it held a secret. "It's special," her grandmother had said. "There's something about that painting that no one else will ever understand." At the time, Eleanor had laughed it off as an old woman's ramblings, but as she stood in front of the painting, a strange feeling crept up her spine. It wasn't that the painting was unsettling, it was beautiful, almost hypnotic. Yet there was something unnerving about the way it seemed to change every time she looked away. The clouds shifted their positions, the colors deepened and lightened with each glance, as if the scene was alive in a way that defied explanation. Eleanor had never been one for superstition, but after weeks of staring at the painting, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than simple art. The first time she noticed it was on a rainy afternoon. She had been sitting on the couch flipping through a book when her eyes wandered to the painting. At first, it appeared just as it always had, an idyllic sky over a rolling meadow, with soft hues of pink and orange blending into the deep blue of twilight. But when she blinked and looked back, the sky had changed. The clouds were no longer scattered and fluffy. Instead, they swirled together in a tight formation, darkening at the edges, and a single ray of sunlight broke through the center, casting a long shadow across the meadow. Eleanor had rubbed her eyes and blinked again, but the scene remained the same. She could feel a slight shiver of unease crawl up her spine, but she quickly dismissed it as her imagination. She returned to her book, trying to forget the unsettling change. But the feeling lingered, as if the painting were watching her, waiting for her attention to return. Every time she looked back at it, it seemed to shift, like the sky was breathing, alive and aware of her presence. Eleanor began to wonder if the painting had always been this way, if it had somehow evolved over time. Later that evening, Eleanor made a cup of tea and sat down on the couch again, staring at the painting. The sky was different now, darker, more ominous. The clouds no longer seemed like natural formations. They looked more like something trying to break free from the confines of the canvas. The longer she looked, the more she began to sense a subtle hum, like the low, distant sound of wind through trees. She closed her eyes, trying to dismiss the feeling, but when she opened them again, the hum was louder. That was when she realized it wasn't just the painting changing. It was her perception of it. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere whenever she looked at the canvas. It was as if the world beyond her walls was slipping into the painting, becoming part of it. The landscape she had always assumed was fictional, just a product of the artist's imagination, felt like a real place, a place that existed somewhere just beyond her reach. Over the next few days, Eleanor became obsessed. She found herself staring at the painting for hours, wondering if she could catch another glimpse of the world it depicted, if she could learn the secret it held. She asked her friends if they noticed anything unusual about it, but they simply admired its beauty and moved on, never seeming to see what she saw. They couldn't feel what she felt. To them, it was just a painting. Eleanor, however, could feel the weight of the painting now, like a heavy presence in the room. It was no longer just something to admire. It was something she had to understand. Days turned into weeks, and the painting's hold on Eleanor only grew stronger. The more she studied it, the more details emerged. Details that seemed hidden at first, like subtle patterns in the clouds or the faint outline of distant mountains that had never been visible before. Every time she looked away, it was as if the scene had changed, even though the painting itself remained untouched. It wasn't just the landscape that was shifting. It was the atmosphere in the room. The air felt heavier whenever she was near the painting, as though it was pulling the very energy from the room into its depths. Eleanor found herself losing track of time, staring at the canvas for hours without realizing it. The once peaceful house now felt charged, alive with an invisible force. One evening, as the sun began to set, Eleanor sat down in front of the painting again. She had begun to notice something else. The sky in the painting wasn't just changing, it was reacting to her emotions. On days when she was calm, the sky would remain soft and serene, a peaceful twilight. But on days when she felt anxious or upset, the clouds would darken, swirling into violent storms that seemed to reflect her inner turmoil. This realization unnerved her. She couldn't explain how or why this was happening, but she felt certain that the painting was responding to her, almost as if it could sense her mood, her thoughts. It was as if the artist had somehow captured the essence of emotion itself within the canvas, turning it into a living, breathing thing. One particularly stormy night, Eleanor stood in front of the painting, staring at the darkening sky that seemed to mirror the turmoil in her heart. She was going through a difficult time. Her recent breakup had left her feeling adrift, disconnected from the world. The sky above her was a violent swirl of deep blues and blacks, with jagged streaks of lightning flashing in the distance. The wind outside howled against the windows, and Eleanor could hear the trees bending under its force. As she stood there, feeling the weight of her emotions pressing down on her, she thought she saw something move in the painting. At first, it was just a flicker, something so fleeting that she almost dismissed it as a trick of the light. But then, it happened again. A figure, just on the edge of the canvas, was walking through the meadow, heading toward the distant mountains. It was a man, dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by shadow. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer to the painting, her heart racing. The man was moving, his steps slow and deliberate, as though he was real, an actual person in the world beyond the canvas. She reached out, her fingers almost touching the surface of the painting, but something stopped her. The moment her hand came close, the man disappeared, as though he had never been there. Confused and shaken, Eleanor stepped back from the painting. Her mind was spinning. Was it just her imagination? Had she really seen something? Or was the painting somehow alive? The next day, Eleanor decided to do some research. She had to know more about the artist who had created the painting. She spent hours combing through old newspapers, art galleries, and obscure online forums, looking for any clue that might explain what was happening. After several frustrating days of fruitless searching, she finally stumbled upon a mention of the artist's name in a local archive, a small, forgotten museum in the town where she had grown up. It was said that the artist, a man named Adrian Corwin, had been obsessed with capturing the essence of time itself in his work. He believed that paintings could contain more than just images. They could hold memories, moments, and even emotions. Curious, Eleanor visited the museum the following weekend. The place was small and dusty, tucked away in an old building near the edge of town. Inside, the walls were lined with paintings that seemed to have an ethereal quality, much like her own. She spoke with the curator, a frail, elderly man who seemed more like a keeper of secrets than a scholar of art. "Ah, you've found it," the curator said when Eleanor mentioned the painting. Adrian Corwin was known for his unique approach to art. He believed that the sky was the perfect medium to capture time. He would paint the same scene over and over, but each time he did, he would change something, just a little. The sky, the clouds, the light, it was never the same. He said that the painting itself was alive, and that it could show you more than you could ever imagine. But most people didn't understand him. They thought he was mad. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "So you're saying the painting is alive?" The curator nodded slowly. "In a way. It's not just a representation of a moment. It's the essence of it." Corwin believed that the sky could hold not just memories but emotions and even people. He was convinced that the painting could capture moments from other times, other places if you looked closely enough. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She thought of the man she had seen in the painting. What happened to him? "Corwin vanished years ago," the curator said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some say he got lost in his own work, that the painting took him somewhere he couldn't come back from. Others believe he's still out there, somewhere in the sky he painted, lost in time." Eleanor felt a deep unease settle over her. She had always thought of art as a static thing, a finished piece, a moment frozen in time. But now she wasn't so sure. She had felt it, the painting changing, responding to her. And what if there was more to it? What if the man in the painting was real? What if he was somehow trying to reach her? The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and a growing sense of dread. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about what the curator had said. The idea that the painting wasn't just an image, but a living, breathing thing, kept turning over in her mind. She had to know more, had to understand what was happening. But as the days passed, it became increasingly clear that she wasn't going to find all the answers in books or old museum archives. The answers, she realized, were in the painting itself. That night, Eleanor sat in front of the canvas again, watching as the sky seemed to change before her eyes. The colors of the painting were no longer just beautiful, they were overwhelming, as though they were pulling her in, calling her to step closer, to reach out and touch them. The world outside her window had gone dark, but the painting seemed to glow with an inner light, its surface alive with movement. It was then that she saw him again, the man in the painting. This time, he was standing in the center of the meadow, facing her. His figure was more defined now, as if he had stepped closer to the foreground. His coat flapped in the wind, his face still shrouded in shadow. But this time, something was different. He was looking directly at her, his gaze steady and piercing, as though he knew she was watching him. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She was sure of it now. The man was real, or at least he felt real. She reached out, trembling, her fingers just inches from the surface of the painting. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she couldn't explain why, but she felt an irresistible pull, as though the man was calling to her, urging her to come closer. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow colder. A gust of wind blew through the cracks in the window, and the shadows in the painting deepened, swallowing the light. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the canvas, and in that moment everything seemed to stop. The hum of the painting was louder now, a low, vibrating sound that resonated in her bones. The man in the painting took a step forward, his face still obscured, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his movement. Without thinking, Eleanor pressed her hand against the canvas. The instant her fingers made contact, the world around her seemed to dissolve. The air thickened, and the ground beneath her feet shifted. For a brief, dizzying moment, she felt herself falling into the painting, as if it were a doorway, a portal to another world. The sky above her was no longer just a painting. It was real, a vast, endless expanse stretching out in every direction. The man was there, too, standing just a few feet away. His coat whipped in the wind, and though his face remained hidden, Eleanor felt his presence like a pull, drawing her toward him. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her legs felt heavy as though they were rooted to the ground. The man took another step toward her, and she saw his hand reach out as though he were about to touch her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything snapped back. Eleanor found herself back in her living room, standing in front of the painting, her hand still pressed against the canvas. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked around the room as though expecting something to have changed, but everything was just as it had been, except for one thing. The man was gone. The sky in the painting had shifted again, but this time it was different. The clouds no longer swirled or changed colors. They were still, frozen in place. And where the man had once stood, there was nothing but emptiness. The meadow was empty, the mountains in the distance silent and still. The painting had returned to its original, serene beauty, but something had shifted. The feeling of presence, of life, was gone. Eleanor backed away from the painting, her mind reeling. She didn't know what had just happened, whether it had been a dream, some kind of hallucination, or if the painting truly held some kind of power. But one thing was certain: she could never look at it the same way again. She knew now that there was more to the painting than she could understand, more than anyone could understand. And as she stood there, staring at the empty meadow, she realized that the man wasn't just in the painting. He had been part of it, alive within it somehow, in a way that defied logic and reason. And though he was gone now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, waiting for the next person who would come along, curious enough to step into the world he had created. For Eleanor knew, deep down, that the painting would always be more than just art. It was a door, a passage to another time, another place. And the man would always be there, just on the other side, waiting for someone to come close enough to reach out and cross over.